the University of Kent is going to be telling us about manic responsibility.
Hey, thank you, Abe. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Excellent. So, my name's Elliot. I'm at the University of Kent here. I'm interested in autonomy in a very philosophy of agency, philosophy of action type context, and particularly as it pertains in contexts of mood disorders, so depression, and today we're looking at mania. Responsibility is obviously a core part of any discussion about autonomy, and as are we contending here, quite a large part of responsibility, on my view, turns on these kind of epistemic considerations we're thinking about. So it turns on our hermeneutic resources, it turns on part of the way we form beliefs, and it turns a lot on our epistemic agency. So I'm going to quickly kind of run through the responsibility story I want to tell pertaining to mania, and at the end I want to go into a lot more detail as to the epistemic project and the project of epistemic justice that I think is required to build this kind of responsibility. So, to start with, I take a broadly Scanlonian view of responsibility. I think responsibility practices serve to maintain, repair, and transform our interpersonal relationships. So we hold each other responsible so that the relationships we have between friends, between moral strangers, can continue to be the right kind of relationship. And a lot of what our responsibility practices are doing are repairing these relationships when they get damaged in some way, or transforming them into a different kind of relationship that can better serve its function. So we talk about reactive attitudes a lot of the time in responsibility. On this view, reactive attitudes, which are blaming attitudes, praising attitudes, things like gratitude and pride, these are appropriate or fitting insofar as they accurately portray to us or track the state of a relationship or changes in that relationship. So the reason I'm interested in these relationships particularly is for broadly Aristotelian reasons. I take relationships to be a key area where humans can flourish. And we're interested in humans attaining their good, their flourishing. That requires us to have particular kinds of relationships functioning in particular ways. So responsibility practices are not simply a kind of moral bookkeeping exercise. They're there to make sure that we as human beings can be the best versions of a human animal by having these kind of relationships held together. So that's kind of the view of responsibility. So holding responsibility, often we say it's respectful, or rather it's disrespectful not to hold people responsible. What I want to say is further than that, responsibility practices are necessary for us kind of flourishing as humans. So David Shoemaker has the following view of responsibility. He notes a degree of ambivalence in people's reactive attitudes towards marginal agents, and he distinguishes three faces of responsibility. There is attributability, which I attribute a characteristic to you. I'm evaluating your moral character. I will largely put this one aside. I don't share David Shoemaker's view of the deep self, so I won't have much to say about that today. The other two are the ones that interest me more. So there's answerability. You are answerable insofar as I can evaluate your judgments. And on his view, answerability looks at how you handled the instead of reasons. So you've done something or you formed some belief. There are reasons you should have done something else instead. These are the instead of reasons. The question when we're holding people answerable is we're making an evaluation as to how you handled those instead of reasons. And a person is not answerable if they're just not capable of handling these instead of reasons. Lastly, we have accountability. This evaluates the regard you hold me in and looks more at kind of, do you take me to genuinely be the source of instead of reasons? And we can broaden that out to say, how do I show up on the other side of this relationship with you? Under what description are you taking me to be a party to this relationship? So that's kind of the question of regard. I argue, I'm not going to focus on it here, but I do argue these actually collapse into the same thing. So I hold a pure answerability view of responsibility. That's sort of the overall picture here I want to look at. So quickly, let's have a chat about what's involved in mania. So mania is usually considered to be an episodic phenomenon. So we have episodes of mania or hypomania, which then go into remission. This is somewhat complicated when we recognize that mania or hypomania could be just more of a sine wave. It's the extent to which the symptoms don't entirely remit. Your episode can end, but you'll still be having symptoms of mania for a lot of people through most of your life. So for some people with bipolar disorder, there's always some symptoms present. We only call it an episode when a certain number or cluster or they get to a certain severity obtains, but you're constantly tracking where you are on this kind of roller coaster as you go. So that's one health warning with the sort of episodic view. It tends to involve a number of sort of key Symptoms, I've picked out grandiosity, confidence, excitement, irritability, impulsiveness, and obsessiveness. These are the sort of day-to-day ones. So yeah, we can make lots of terrible decisions that people regret. People can become dangerous to themselves in certain contexts. This is at a certain extreme. Most of the time, when you're experiencing milder mania or sort of the beginnings of a manic episode, it won't be that severe. But things like exceeding confidence, excitement about something, the sense that it's really, really worth talking about at length, at people, these are quite common features of mania that are particularly involved, I think, in your moral or your normative outlook. So grandiosity is a sense of oneself as being hugely important or capable of great things. There's lots of fittingness discussions that are just implicit in that, similar with the confidence. Excitement and impulsiveness, I think, are particularly involved with your view of some action or some object as being worthy of attention, worthy of celebration, or worthy of immediately being acted upon. The kind of obsessiveness ties into these kind of fixations, talking about the new Wikipedia rabbit hole you've fallen down, and you need to explain to everyone just how interesting the contents of that was. These are quite common features of mania, and they all have an evaluation of some object or some action underpinning. That seems to be what's at work there. So I argue that a lot of this manic thinking or this manic mindset is underpinned by a pervasive sense of urgency. So by urgency, I sort of pick out the sense where the action in question is something that must be done, and it must be done now. There's a lot of talk about talk in terms of demands is quite common in sort of the phenomenology and the literature we have, people describing their mania. And I can go into some details in the Q&A if people are interested. So I think of this sense of urgency as demanding certain things from us, from making the moment one in which we must act. And therefore, from Shoemaker, on the Shoemaker's view, we might be inclined to say urgency causes us to fumble our instead of reasons. This action is demanded of us now. We might even have lost access to the reasons we should do something else instead. If we've lost access to these instead of reasons, our answerability is defeated. So this is a sense in which we cease to be responsible. One face of responsibility is lost. Now, Shoemaker doesn't make specifically this move. He talks only really about attributability in the context of mania, but this is how I understand his theory would apply to the picture of mania I've picked out. If we are understanding it, if I'm sort of reading into the way he's described it, I want to offer this counterexample, however. Rather than strictly silencing instead of reasons, mania is only tends to demote them. So we've got Jameson's description here of her own manic episode, one in which she bought 20 sundry penguin paperbacks because she thought it'd be adorable if they could form a colony on her coffee table, which I think is kind of delightful. I couldn't worry about money if I tried, so I don't. The money will come from somewhere. I'm entitled, God will provide. What we have here is a recognition of one of the instead of reasons. I couldn't worry about money if I tried does seem to indicate that she had made some effort to try. She's aware that this reason speaks against the action she's engaged in, but it's for some reason unable to attain weight in her deliberation. Ruth Chang talks about practical certainty, which is when you have epistemic doubts about whether this is the right thing to do, but entertaining those doubts would defeat your overall practical project in some way. So it's no longer practically rational to deliberate further. One of the sort of ways we might understand this kind of urgency in mania is it brings the practical certainty threshold down. It's very easy to become practically certain of what you should do, even if that sense is misleading. So Jameson can still recite her instead of reasons. They've just kind of lost a sort of status. So this is where I get to what I think is the interesting part of the manic case. Different interlocutors are going to accept different instead of reasons as being relevant. So I think about the instance of Sorley MacLean, who was considering going off to fight in the Spanish Civil War. He had all these sort of reasons to do it. He had all these reasons not to. And we have in his letters and his poetry, him deliberating at length on this. But what's interesting to me is it seems that different people he speaks to, if he had chosen to go off and join the international brigades, different interlocutors would have accepted different kinds of instead of reasons as relevant. His parents would have insisted, why are you throwing your life away on this project? You probably have no chance of surviving. His students and his literary colleagues would have had a different set of instead of reasons, saying, look, yeah, it's important that we defeat fascism, but you're one of the promising poets in the Gaelic language. We can't afford to lose you. Ever Ban, who's the somewhat mysterious figure from his poetry, might have accepted a different set of instead of reasons in that MacLean thinks of her as being a bit sympathetic to the fascists. But in each case, what the relevant instead of reasons are change with the interlocutor in question. So this, I think, is going to start complicating our picture. But before I get on to my solution, I wanted to add this one more layer of complication to add to that. So Andrea Westlund offers the view of self-answerability, which is not doing precisely the same work as answerability, but they are quite closely related. Someone is self-answerable insofar as they have the disposition to justify their view of reasons in the right contexts. So basically, you are not simply acting on reasons, you're not simply acting on received reasons, you have something to say as to why this is a proper view of the normative landscape to take. The interesting thing she points out is that these interlocutors can reside in the moral imagination. So you can exercise this disposition, or you can show this disposition if you're thinking about what you would say to someone who asked you the question properly. So the moral imagination is all that's acquired here. What I notice is that with the grandiosity that comes with Mania, with the sort of global or eons long perspective that sometimes attention focuses on, the people in your moral imagination might be Sappho and Ossian and Byron and MacLean, rather than your friends, colleagues, and employers. So it's going to be a different set of people to whom you're thinking that you have to, give an account of how you've handled the instead of reasons. But what I want to point out is that manic people probably do just routinely have this disposition. I'm not making universal claims, of course, but I think a very common feature of mania is frustration with people who just insist on being obstinately mundane about questions, and they don't keep up, and they're not properly appreciating just how interesting and important these minor facts about, Minoan and Crete are that you're obsessing over, right? This sense of frustration, I think, it speaks to a clear desire to be understood and to have one's own view of the normative landscape reflected. It's a frustration with other people for not taking as relevant what seems obviously relevant to yourself. So I think what we have here is an indication that in typical cases of mania, people are still self-answerable. They're still disposed to answer interlocutors in their moral imagination with a view as to what is relevant, what is not relevant, why this is a proper view of the moral relationship. And I don't think this is not particular to mania. I think most of the time we tend to assume our interlocutors share our sense of reasons. We get frustrated with people for doing things where it's obviously having an effect on us that we prefer had not happened. And it takes us a moment to realize, well, they're thinking about something else. Now, how this is affecting me is not the first thing on their mind, neither could I expect it to be. But our first instinct, I think, is still to assume everyone else. Our first instinct is to apply our sense of reasons more broadly. There might be a question as to whether mania makes it harder to entertain other views of reasons. That's something to explore in another space. But I think what we've got here is a question as to what are the relevant instead of reasons, turning largely on who the interlocutor is, and a disagreement between two interlocutors as to what the relevant reasons are. So very briefly, I want to talk a little bit, I think this is a regard question as well. So this is why we're bringing the two faces of responsibility together. It's a question of what reasons are regarded as relevant when you and I are having an interaction. So when we interact, if I don't think the reasons you take as relevant are relevant, and I'm kind of unwilling to negotiate there, I seem to be interacting with an imagined person who agrees with me. And there's this reasonable complaint you could have that, look, who's on the other side of this relationship with you? Is it me, or is it some imagined person you've made up, or is it some reflex of yourself that you've kind of dressed up to look like me? But it's not me that you're interacting with. So I think that there's that kind of worry there. I won't spend too long on that because we're a little tight on time. So this is the core thing I think is going on in these responsibility cases. We have a disagreement over the relevant instead ofs. Which instead ofs are relevant? What then do we do with this disagreement? Well, Mohammed Rashed has offered a model for reconciliation of contested identity claims that I think can be quite instructive. And this view turns largely on participation in hermeneutic projects. It's largely a view, or it's largely an argument turning on distributive hermeneutic justice. So for an identity claim such as I'm a member of this community, or I am this particular person, he invites us, he distinguishes between controversial and failed claims. A controversial claim is one in which people might not accept it, but we are being invited by the person making the claim to revise the boundaries of some social category. It's not in this sense, it's a controversial claim, not a failed claim. We might still reject controversial claims, but as long as we're being invited to engage in this revision, it's still successfully a claim to identity. So I want to apply this model in this instance. Is the manic person giving reasons to shift the boundaries of relevance? Well, I think insofar as that they are self-answerable, then yes, they are offering reasons for that. I think it's fairly transparent in these cases that there is a view as to what is relevant that we could negotiate over. And so that's probably what's valuable for us to do. How am I doing for time? Yeah, I'll maybe jump through. So there's two moves I want to make to motivate the view that we should be engaging in this what Rashed calls reconciliation, but he means a particular reconciliation of recognition here, bringing together our senses of meaning. So the first one is standing. So following Rashed, I think manic people who are engaged in this kind of disagreement certainly have standing to participate in it. It's a claim to have standing to negotiate the boundaries of relevance. What this means is we're negotiating the act description and the context description. So what is the thing that you're holding me responsible for, or I'm holding you responsible for? Is it something I did today? Is it participating in the long trend of something I've done over years? Is it participating in a centuries-long system of oppression for some particular group? Which act is the one in question? Which context is the one in question? And this will mean manic people who are looking at the entirety of the history of art and think it's really important that they make this contribution now, are making a claim as to what is the relevant context. And the important thing here is, if the relationship is to function, if we were to negotiate the standards of relevance in order to hold each other responsible for the purposes of maintaining our relationships, then what we need is an acknowledgement that both parties have standing to contribute to that, because the relationship is something that we are putting together. So, and again, this is the sort of the broader trend at the end. Who is included in this relationship? When we get to episodic mania, where someone seems to have changed, I think the reasonable question is, look, is it me that you're including, or are you remembering someone I was some time ago and including them? Yes, we're all going to shift in some way in what we think is relevant, and to recognize each other in these relationships, we do need a degree of flexibility in how we sort of imagine each other. The problem is, it really hurts to see someone who is very depressed, or see someone in certain kinds of manic state, and think that your friend or your brother or something is suffering or has ceased to be the person that they were. This is a very difficult thing for friends and family to go through, but nonetheless, it is important to recognize that the view of the person you're interacting with is the manic view at this point in time. And you have to have enough flexibility to accommodate that. Otherwise, we're not having the interaction where both people are parties to the relationship. One person is a party to the relationship. On the other side of that relationship is an imagined being. That's sort of the difficulty here. So the standing attaches to the manic point of view, or even the depressive point of view, specifically because if it doesn't, we can't have the kind of relationship that responsibility practices are meant to protect. So that's my claim about standing here. And this is standing to negotiate boundaries of relevance, which is a hermeneutic exercise. This moves us towards what Rashed describes as reconciliation. So responsibility maintains, it repairs and transforms these relationships. Intimate relationship of this kind rely on the kind of virtuous hearing Fricker talked about. So she gives us this story about we need to cultivate the right kind of hearing, where we're going to listen for the things we're not going to understand and seek them out. What she, however, at the end of that discussion moves to say, look, a lot of the time this means you're going to reserve judgment. We can't reserve judgment, because the end we're looking for is not truth. The end we're looking for is the maintenance or support of this relationship. We actually can't simply reserve judgment, because we need to specify, for the purposes of our relationship, how is this action going to play? What description do we take this under for the purposes of maintaining our relationship? So reserving judgment isn't an option for us. We need to negotiate how we stipulate it. And the only way to not stipulate it is to, in some way, further impair our relationship. So the immediate end, the sort of interim end Fricker's talking about, is a kind of the virtue is getting our credibility judgments right. In this instance, the immediate end is not getting credibility judgments right. So we can't rely simply on virtuous hearing there. We need to go beyond that and say, look, even if virtuous hearing or the epistemic norms would have us reserving judgment, we still need to make a decision as to how this will play, what meaning we're going to ascribe to this interaction for the purposes of our relationship. Because the ultimate end of this relationship of this practice is maintaining our relationships as a site of our flourishing. So towards the end, just at the end of time, what kind of social epistemic project am I looking for? So there's cultural reconciliation. This is what Rashed offers. People engaged in mad activism rightly demand that we can write mad narratives into the cultural repertoire. This is really important because people who are not used to mania, have no experience in mania, will rely on the cultural repertoire to make sense of their interactions with someone who is manic. Manic people need these sort of narratives, not only so that someone can understand us, but also so that we have standing to enter into the negotiations. It's really difficult to articulate your position on reasons if you don't have these kind of resources. So in part, this is not simply a a distribution of hermeneutic power. This is something people have to do themselves to create these narratives that they can then use in their relationships before they're shared out. So there's a sort of a generative project required as well. And non-manic people need to genuinely engage in these negotiations. So the identity of mad person is kind of unagenting in many ways. That is an obstacle to the kind of relationship I'm describing. And it's a defeater for the relationship status as a site of flourishing. So manic people need to generate and share suitable narratives. This is an exercise in hermeneutic generation and turns on a lot of distributive hermeneutic justice questions. There's some important epistemology on how manic people generate those. We can talk about those next time. But for now, this is the kind of project I'm envisaging. And I will leave you with that. And cited sources and everything for now.